called School Bites. And so I have some thoughts on zombies and the genre and what it has to do with libertarianism and anarchy. So the topic of my talk today is the Undead Democracy Apocalypse. As you can see, we're going to be talking about zombies as a metaphor for the most part. We're going to talk a little bit about some other monsters just briefly. So the best monsters are something human. Like they're supernatural, they're magical, sometimes they're scientific, but they're always a metaphor for something fundamentally human. And the ones that succeed in cinema are the ones that appeal to a metaphor that that we feel, that is visceral for us. So the Wolfman, for example, is, he comes from a sort of folkloric fear of the forest, but now he's really more of a fear of human rage. It's the person who can't control their own anger and lashes out and attacks their loved ones, right? You could argue that the Incredible Hulk is a mutation of this metaphor. The vampire is traditionally, in folklore, a fear of plague or a fear of death, but he's taken on these sort of sexual undertones, and so he's become this sort of modern cinema fear of unrequited love or jealousy or rape or these sorts of things. Like, this is the way that the metaphor has evolved. So the zombie's a really unique character, and he's been incredibly popular, or they have, in the last, say, 10, 20 years, and I want to talk about why that is. So if you look at sort of the staples of the genre, Walking Dead is one of the most successful television shows in the history of television. It's one of the only ones that gets more viewers than Sunday Night Football. In 2010 and 2012, it was voted the best program of the year by the American Film Institute, and the comic book has won various awards. You should really check this out. It's called We're Alive. It's a podcast. It's free on iTunes, and it won Best Podcast of the Year in 2012. And it's an episodic zombie radio show, sort of like the old style radio storytelling mode, right? And then The Last of Us is a people will argue whether or not they're zombies because they're fungus based, but it's essentially a zombie game. And they won. They were ranked #1 by Empire Magazine's list of the 100 greatest video games of all time. And it's a phenomenal game. Like, I did not play the game because I'm not a big fan of first-person shooters. But what I did was I went to YouTube and I watched other people play the game, and it plays like a movie. It's heart-wrenching. The main characters are very well developed. The dialogue is good. You could watch this game like it's a movie. So this is sort of what's going on in the culture right now. We're also seeing some mutations in the genre. You could argue that the Reavers from Firefly are really a zombie aesthetic. They're not quite like a Romero zombie, but they are like space cannibals, right? Warm Bodies was an attempt to sort of make a romantic comedy out of zombies. It didn't really work, but you can see that people are sort of trying new things, trying to find a metaphoric home for the zombie. And then the Resident Evil franchise, this is probably one of the more successful zombie franchises because it starts as a video game and now they've got animated movies and live action movies. And they've also played with this idea of literal mutations, that there are these different classes of zombies, things like that. But to get where the metaphor is going, we've got to figure out where it's from, right? So before Night of the Living Dead, zombie movies were a very different thing than they are now. They were largely metaphors for slavery. The sort of operating system of the zombie was this voodoo curse that you could like put on a person, and it would take away their will and make them into a docile slave. It wasn't really about digging out of a graveyard. It wasn't about rising from the dead. So you have these various movies in the 30s and 40s that they don't follow the zombie aesthetic we're used to. It's not about hordes of zombies wandering the city. It's all about a single monster, a single wizard or scientist, and a damsel in distress. And this was the operating system at the time. So it's not terribly different from Frankenstein or Dracula or any of these. And they're also like explicitly about slavery, like two of these. Which one is it? I Walk with a Zombie and White Zombie are both about slave plantations. They're about a person who needs zombies as slaves for a sugar plantation, right? So it's pretty explicit. The zombies are often African-American characters. So you have these voodoo origins of at least the word zombie, right? But you also have these vampiric origins. So if you look at sort of like the taxonomic classification of monsters, zombies are kind of like a distant cousin of vampires. I Am Legend came out in 1954 by Richard Matheson, and he did one thing to the vampire myth. He said, no, it's not a count in a castle like a lord in the land, it's everybody, right? And so I Am Legend was the first book to really talk about a worldwide apocalypse or a plague that turned people into these sort of ravenous monsters. But he wasn't writing about zombies, he was writing about vampires. And if you look at sort of the early movie adaptations, they're still talking about vampires. But I Am Legend comes out in 2007, which I mean that's probably the one most people have seen, and now it's explicitly about zombies. So the zombie genre has sort of like consumed its own origin story, right? Like we've gone from vampires to zombies. So the Matheson vampire is a very different thing than Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? And so I want to like just sort of explain why that is. So this is a quote when he first describes the monster in the book I Am Legend. He says, "Why do you wish them destroyed? Ah, see, you have turned the poor guileless innocent into a hunted animal. He has no means of support, no means of proper education. He has not the voting franchise. No wonder he is compelled to seek out a predatory nocturnal existence." So you see, they're monsters because they can't vote. I mean, that's really the problem. If vampires could vote, they would all vote for blood, and that's democracy, right? Because they outnumber you. So what Richard Matheson really did was he democratized the vampire, and he gave us the zombie. It's of all the monsters in all the folklores and all the movies in the world, the thing that makes the zombie genre unique is that they're the majority, right? So if you look at Dracula, it's usually one vampire or a handful of vampires against a whole village. You look at the Wolfman, same thing. It's maybe one werewolf, maybe it's a werewolf and a son or something against a whole village. You even look at Frankenstein. Like, Frankenstein is arguably a zombie. Like, he's raised from the dead. He's this sort of monster. He fits into the damsel in distress model of the zombie movies from the 30s, but he's not a zombie. He's his own monster. And the reason is because it's the monster versus the village, whereas with zombies, it's the village versus the survivors. The monsters outnumber the main characters in the story. So, I Am Legend gives rise to Night of the Living Dead. George Romero's original movie came out in 1968. And he admitted that his movie was inspired by I Am Legend. It was sort of based visually on the Vincent Price Last Man on Earth. If you watch those two movies, they're very similar. They're filmed in black and white. The people are in these disheveled, sort of ratty clothing, and they're pounding on doors and windows, and the person has to board themselves up in the house. Like, that's the archetype, that's the trope of the zombie story from the beginning. But George Romero did a lot of things sort of by accident. For example, he didn't call them zombies in the movie. It was actually fans that came and called them zombies. He originally called them skin eaters. And in the movie, he only calls them ghouls. So he was not explicitly trying to launch a zombie genre. It was the fans of the movie that said, no, this is a zombie movie. And it wasn't until one of the later ones, I think the remake of Day of the Dead, they finally actually started calling them zombies. But so he has this whole genre, right? So some other things he did by mistake. A lot of people hailed Night of the Living Dead as a blow for racial equality because the hero is African American, which was really uncommon at the time, and he slaps a Caucasian woman, which is unheard of in cinema, and at the time. And so the fact that this character broke all of the sort of racial stereotypes that were embedded in cinema at the time had people both sort of like all this analytical critique and all this sort of like it was seen as this pioneer movie and all this stuff. But the fact of the matter is, he just didn't change the script. He wrote a script for a white character, he casted an African American character, and then refused to change the script. So, like, it is literally equality. It's not like he was like trying to make a point. It's like he just refused to change the script based on the race of the character. And the same thing happened in the remake. In Night of the Living Dead, he says that the remake was apologizing for Barbara in the first one. That he carried over this damsel in distress, and Barbara in Night of the Living Dead is this totally inept character, and he didn't do it on purpose, but when he watched it, he said he offended himself. And so he made a female heroine in the remake. And you see that throughout, that's a trope in zombie movies now, is that the female characters are often stronger than the male characters. But so he has this whole empire of zombie movies. And I argue that that he's failing at it because he doesn't get the central metaphor, and that is that zombies are a metaphor for democracy. Romero thinks that zombies are a metaphor for consumerism, and for that reason, he puts his movies in shopping malls. He tries to force them to fulfill that metaphor for him, and as a result, they get worse and worse. His original trilogy was very popular. The remakes are less popular. A lot of people hated Land of the Dead. Most people haven't even heard of Diary of the Dead and Survival of the Dead. So like they keep giving him more money, and he keeps making worse movies because he created it fundamentally by accident, which is the way metaphors work. Artists play with metaphors and things happen. Sometimes you don't even know why. So I want to talk about intellectual property. By some sort of like miracle of fate, Night of the Living Dead is not copyrighted. He filled out the paperwork incorrectly, and he copyrighted the show title Night of the Skin Eaters. And then he changed the name of the movie and didn't change the paperwork, and as a result, he never copyrighted the movie. And as a result, people are free to make remakes of Night of the Living Dead to this day, and we have an entire genre because it wasn't copyrighted. If he had intellectual property over it, there might never have been any of the remakes or any of the spin-offs. There was a very popular series of movies called Return of the Living Dead, which Romero had nothing to do with, and they were a different sort of monster. I mean, it was the same idea. It was herds of zombies, but they probably couldn't have made those movies if they had copyrighted Night of the Living Dead. And so we get to Walking Dead. This is sort of the pinnacle of the zombie genre, and this is a very famous line. This is not a democracy anymore. You see shades of this throughout the zombie genre. This is sort of Rick is the sheriff, and he has this cast of heroes that sort of travel with him. And the writer, Robert Kirkman, said it's a zombie movie that never ends. And so, like most zombie movies, they end like we're looking for a boat, we get on a boat, we make it or not. We try to get to an island, we make it or not. This is like, no, like after the outbreak, after you've found a secure place, how do you rebuild society, right? How do the survivors begin to trade? How do the survivors defend themselves from other humans who are the primary threat? Like the zombies become a setting piece. They're not the primary characters, they're the background. And Rick very famously said, this is not a democracy anymore. And the fans ate it up, and they coined the term the Ricktatorship. And so it was sort of, there's this acknowledgement that like democracy didn't work in the world that they're building. And I want to talk about, so here, this is Josh Sapan, AMC CEO. AMC is the studio that makes Walking Dead. And he said, we hope that zombies live forever, and that we've only begun to find out what the post-apocalyptic world is like. In 2022, we'll be discussing the fact that The Walking Dead is not over. At that point, I think we'll be in a complete free enterprise world in which there are no nation states. So that's a bold statement of anarcho-capitalism. That his sort of vision for The Walking Dead and the society that they're building in the show is an anarcho-capitalist one. And if you take that, I mean, you have to keep in mind he's not a writer, he's not a showrunner, he's the CEO. So he probably has some influence, but he's not writing the line by line of the show or anything. But if you look at the other stuff AMC does, you see this trend throughout all of it, right? Like Breaking Bad is essentially one big, long, libertarian macho flash against the law on drugs. And Mad Men is essentially a slap in the face to the haters of capitalism. So if you view it this way, you can see The Walking Dead as sort of an ongoing show. It's a libertarian macho flash against the nation state. The first season was a sort of standard good cop, bad cop scenario. The good cop is the one who's holding out for government assistance, and the bad cop is holding out for government assistance, and the good cop is the one who takes off his badge and says, no, this is the world we live in now, and he embraces that. The second season's all about property rights. They live on this man's farm, and it's about the good cop Rick is the one who respects the farmer's property rights. The bad cop Shane is the one who tries to violate his property rights or force his way into the house. The third season and fourth season, our primary villain is the governor, right? So there's these like libertarian themes throughout the whole show. And if you read the comic book, it gets even more explicit. At this point where we are in the comic book, there's essentially multiple safe havens, and the heroes are the townships that are willing to trade with each other, that build trade routes, and the villains are the ones who raid those safe havens and steal their supplies. So, like, we're literally seeing the emergence of a society in this world of The Walking Dead that doesn't have a nation state. So there's this metaphor, right? Like, zombies are a metaphor for democracy. And we know this is true because we see it in politics. people get it, right? That when a person goes out to vote in mass, they're a horde of people going out to commit aggression. And the zombie is the perfect monster for that. So every candidate you see, you can find pictures of every candidate photoshopped to look like a zombie. In the case of Ron Paul, most of them are photoshopped of the crowd looking like zombies, because I think everyone sort of got that that was not about the man. But this is just embedded in it, right? So the other thing we get is that we call things zombie banks, right? So we get that people understand that this system that we've got in democracy is not sustainable in the same way that a zombie is not sustainable. That they consume forever, they have no real sort of interest in preservation of themselves. They're just aggressive for aggression's sake, and democracy is fundamentally the same thing. It's about consuming more and providing more without paying for it at the expense of others. So the metaphor is pretty solid. So I want to talk about some themes. This is, sorry for the wall of text, but just sort of wrapping up. There are these themes throughout zombie movies that are sort of becoming tropes, and they're really sort of libertarian in scope, right? So the infection is usually man-made. It's usually perpetuated by the government. It's not like vampires. It was always some ancient curse or some biblical thing, right? Like with zombies, there's this pressure to give it a scientific explanation and blame it on the government or a big corporation. Like Resident Evil is the umbrella corporation. The military and the police are always incompetent in zombie movies. They either fail to protect you or they become the villains who are stealing from you. And that's been a trope since the early Romero movies with Major Rhodes. Major Rhodes is willing to kill people if you don't obey him. Major Rhodes is sort of funny in the name too. The zombie apocalypse is always worse in cities where the government is strongest. The best survivors are always the rural prepper types. Which is, again, these are the people who are least reliant on the government are the best survivors in a zombie apocalypse. So you end up with heroes in these movies that spout libertarian rhetoric all the time. The character who holds out for the government rescue is the first to die. This is sort of like, if you guys have seen Cabin in the Woods, or you see that sort of genre of horror movie, it's the first couple to sneak off and have sex is the first to die. Like there's a moral tale in these sorts of in the Evil Dead type of movies. So the moral tale in zombie movies is the person who trusts the government is the first to die, right? And there's a morality to that when it's beaten into the audience over and over again, it sinks in. This is another thing. Your friends and family are now trying to eat your face. And this is, I think, probably one of the more important parts of the democratic metaphor is in a democracy, your friends and family are literally voting for aggression against you. And if you reject democracy as a system, if you are a full anarcho-capitalist, that's really apparent. Like when you go to Thanksgiving and your parents ask you how you voted, or maybe your kids, I don't know, and you say you didn't, or you say you voted differently than them, suddenly there's a fight. So there's this idea that the aggression is coming from the home front in a zombie movie, right? And so that's very analogous to democracy. So more than the monster, like I said, monsters are background, the zombies are the setting. Zombie movies are about a complete collapse of society. Utilities are gone, services are gone, roads are breaking down, water and electricity becomes an issue. It's about a collapse scenario. And so I think that the success of the zombie genre is more than just like fear of the dead or fear of the plague or whatever. It is about a fear that people have of a complete collapse scenario. Maybe it's not the idea of a man-made biological weapon that they fear or something like that, but even an economic collapse. They fear that the things that they've grown dependent on will be taken away, and how will they survive after that? And this is essentially the inevitable result of a democratic system is a collapse, right? Because you have to continually promise a voter more and more to vote for things that they don't want to pay for. It's an unsustainable scenario, just like a zombie has to eat and eat but doesn't digest anything, right? So essentially, like what I'm getting at with this presentation is that there's this intense, unacknowledged fear in the population that democracy isn't working. It's like this. It's like in the Matrix, he says there's a splinter in your mind, right? So the fact that this genre is popular, and the fact that this genre contains all of these themes, and especially these anti-democratic themes, right? Because we say like democracy is two wolves and a sheep deciding on dinner. Well, if you obey that ethic, the zombie wins, right? Like democracy is 10 zombies and a sheriff deciding on dinner. So the fact that this is popular and the fact that this appeals to people mean that there's this latent fear that democracy isn't working and that this system isn't working, which means that there are also these sort of latent libertarian voluntarist principles in the population, which they don't actually go out to the polls and vote on, but those are the movies that they want to see. So like the culture embraces these things, even if it doesn't manifest in the politics. And like really the fundamental theme is the triumph of the individual over the collective, right? And that's everywhere. That's not just zombies. That's Hunger Games. That's The Matrix. That's V for Vendetta. That's like every movie that's been any kind of a box office hit in the last 20 years. The like primary theme has been the triumph of the individual over the collective. So I guess what I'm saying is you don't always have to talk to people about politics. And this is sort of the, I'm sort of done with the slides. But my pitch is, when you're done with a libertarian convention like this, when you're done sort of coming here and sort of stewing in your own principles, and you know, collaborating with these like-minded people, choose an interest of your own and go to a convention of that topic, right? Because if it's appealing to you, it's probably appealing to you for these sorts of reasons. So I, for example, I've written this book, right? And so I go to Walker Stalker Con, which is, there's 8 of them a year, it's a zombie convention, and it's a fan convention. And I've got placed on the ethics panel. You know, go figure. Zombie conventions have ethics panels. And so it gives me this opportunity to get on a stage in front of people who are not there to think about politics, they're there to think about zombies. But you can throw this stuff into their language, and you can present it to them in the characters and stories that they understand. So maybe you're into science fiction, maybe you're into knitting, I don't know, maybe you're into baking. But I think something that the Liberty Movement could really use at this point is if all of us took our own unique individualistic interests and spread out, and spread those ideas to those communities when they're least expecting it. So I guess I'm open to questions and answers if people have any questions. Yeah.
I'll just make a comment. I have 2 teenagers who watch The Walking Dead religiously, and even now I feel much better about them watching it because they're getting libertarian views. I've never watched it, so it sounds awesome. I'm going to sit down with them and watch it.
It's worth checking out, because like even the show has sort of doubled down on the libertarian stuff compared to the comic. Like in the first season, there's this whole story arc where they go to the CDC, which was the bad cop suggestion, and that doesn't appear in the comic book. But you get this sort of view of like, how did the government respond to the outbreak? And there's like one scientist left in the entire building, and he says, oh yeah, everyone just couldn't cut it, and so they all committed suicide. Like that was the bureaucratic response, was they all killed themselves. So, I mean, yeah, I mean it's worthwhile, and it's going to get more interesting if they follow the comic book more. The next major villain is this character named Negan, which is a neologism of Nixon and Reagan, and he's literally like the embodiment of the state. Like he doesn't even have ego. Like you could insult him and punch him in the face, and he won't take anything personally as long as you obey. Like that's his primary thing. Is he's building the new order, and you're going to obey. And the new order is he provides you services that you don't ask for, and then you pay for them. So, like if you put that on mainstream television, I don't know how people couldn't make the connection to the state. You know what I mean? Yeah.
What I thought about watching The Walking Dead is that the feeling you get about human nature is a lot worse than what I've gotten by dealing with people in general. There's the zombies, sure, but there's actual, people that aren't zombies yet, and the villains, And I guess in the show, maybe it's the zombie genre or whatever, it's kind of split 50-50. You know, 50% of people are the libertarian, uphold your principles and voluntarists, etc. And then the other half are the villains, and they're all doing bad stuff. But that's not an accurate ratio.
No, it's not.
To my mind, okay.
So something interesting, I don't know that this is a zombie thing, but this is definitely an AMC thing, that the characters are not necessarily perfect libertarians, right? Like Rick makes all kinds of mistakes. Like he offers to give over Michonne as a hostage, as a peace offering, so that the governor can kill her for no reason, right? That's not really, it's not the right move, right? And it doesn't happen. But what it seems like the AMC shows, I mean, the Breaking Bad's a perfect example, right? Like those are not perfect libertarian characters, but it seems like they're writing a libertarian world, right? So even if the characters are not principled and ethical, the universe they live in is. And so when they make the wrong decision, it has consequences and it comes back to bite them. Yeah, which is reality.
I guess the bug that I wanted to put in your head is that idea that, I mean, I ran a scenario in my head. If you did The Walking Dead and you did a more accurate ratio about who's a villain and who's not, there would be a war between humans and zombies, and we would win pretty quickly because there just wouldn't be any bad actors. We'd all be huddling together with our guns.
Maybe.
I mean, there'd be a few bad actors, but they would turn into zombies.
I mean, yeah, in all likelihood, if a real zombie apocalypse happened, they'd be put down pretty quickly. I don't think that there's a lot of risk of that, but that's the suspension of disbelief you accept for the metaphor, right? Like the metabolism of a zombie makes absolutely no sense. Like they wander around for 3 years whether they eat or not. Like,
Yeah, the other thing I always think when I watched the first season is like, why don't they just go to a cold climate? The zombies would freeze.
Yeah.
But the thing that I never
You know,
figured that out.
incidentally, and the same is true of democracy. I mean, like the state is much slower and less effective in New Hampshire than places like California. So.
To answer the gentleman in the back, in a way, even though you could say, first of all, we're not living under fear. People act differently when they're in abject fear, and some people will respond. It'll bring out the best, and some people will bring out the worst.
Mm-hmm.
But we do actually, in a democracy, we do have to fear our neighbors because my well-intentioned neighbors constantly vote away my rights.
Right.
And so they are eating me, in a way.
Right.
They are feeding on me because they don't get that other people are not their property. You know, like they don't see the aggression in the law.
But they see it when they make political cartoons, right? When they're opposed to the other party or the other camp, they get that the other camp is aggressing against them.
Yeah.
But they don't get that they're aggressing against the other camp.
Yeah.
Right? Like they don't see it as a war. They see it as that's just the brainless hordes who are not as enlightened as me.
It's just a more it's an impersonal, non-physical war.
Yeah.
And stuff, but it still is.
That's why it's a metaphor.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Just to, you brought something to mind, people are really interested in Game of Thrones these days, right? And that has a conflict of ice and zombies.
Oh.
Yeah, I haven't watched Game of Thrones, but yeah, I do. I've heard of this.
And the whole show is about how ridiculous and evil all the rulers are.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
They all just kill each other off. Everyone dies.
But that's again to the larger theme, right? The individual versus the collective. I don't think that there's a successful movie anywhere that doesn't show some corruption in the leadership or show the hero's uniqueness as a minority is what makes him a hero. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the essential individualism. Yeah.
What about Star Trek? Some of the Star Treks, in the Federation. There seems to be kind of an idealistic view of the Federation.
Sure.
I haven't really studied it.
Well, I mean, Gene Roddenberry was a Marxist to some extent. In the early Star Trek, it was against the rules to have money. So, I mean, it's really like the economic illiteracy is palpable. So he says it's a rule that there cannot be any money, and the way we're going to get rid of money is we're going to get rid of scarcity, and the way we're going to get rid of scarcity is we're going to create these replicators that just give you whatever you want. You go up to the computer, you say, "Give me a chocolate sundae," and there it is. but then they're constantly looking for dilithium crystals.
Yeah, I know. It's-
Right.
Yeah, there's
So-
no consistency.
So dilithium crystals can't be replicated. They're used for
Yeah.
propulsion. Some planets wear them as jewelry. They're divisible and fungible.
Yeah.
So-
It doesn't make sense.
yeah, it's economically illiterate. Once Gene Roddenberry was gone, and that rule sort of started leaving the scene, you started getting Ferengi, and you started getting like Deep Space Nine was all about the black market.
Yeah.
And so this is the thing: when you create a metaphor that doesn't work, if you keep at it, the story will take away the inaccuracies from you.
And who is seeing Serenity or
Firefly. Yeah.
That's a more libertarian view, I think, of the
Space travel.
space alliances.
Yeah. Same thing. It's
Yeah.
the rebels versus the alliance,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So if we're all square, I realize that was a short presentation, but maybe you guys all want to get to lunch. Also, if you look on your chairs, this is the first chapter of my zombie novel. Max escapes from school. So you can take a look at that. If you,
Too smart to die.
If you like it, you can find it on the website. I have a few at the table. And the second book is written. It's with the editor now. It's much more explicit than the first one. The first one people have called Home Alone with Zombies, and it's really just sort of like an introduction of the character of Max, who has a libertarian upbringing, but there's not a lot of opportunity because it's about the monster. The second book is called School Bites. People have called the Animal Farm with Zombies, because he's taken to a refugee center against his will and held for his own protection. So,
Gotcha.
Right.
so thanks for coming. Thanks for listening, and I'll be around the rest of the weekend. Thank you.